Happy New Year, guys. I hope the New Year's been great to you so far. For me personally, I've literally spent every single day this year sick so far, but I'm finally starting to feel better and I just couldn't take it anymore. I had to get down to the shop and just try to build something. So for today's project, we're gonna start pretty simple. My mom actually got me this little cheese slicer kit here from Rockler. And so the project for today is just to make sort of a mini cutting board that I can install this into. Like I said, super simple, but it gets me back into this shop and it gets me building again, and that makes me very, very happy. All right, let's get started. First step for this build was figuring out what size I wanted this cheese slicer board to be. Now it doesn't need to be very big, so I just took a couple of measurements of the hardware to give me an idea of what size to aim for. I'm going to be making this board entirely from scrap wood left over from last year's project, so I just grabbed a couple of walnut and maple boards to get started. I'll be ripping these boards into 7/8 inch strips. I chose this width simply because it allowed me to get the most amount of cuts out of each piece. Once I finished ripping my strips over on the table saw, it was time to get them to the thickness I needed. Now I'll be taking care of this at the planer. Now I'm not a big fan of running small strips through the planer individually, so I decided to run them all through together at once by attaching them to a planer sled with some double-sided tape. Now I'd already gotten these boards pretty flat, so I really only needed to run one side through to get them to the thickness I was after. Now it was time to run the walnut pieces through, and this time I'm going to test out a different method. I had some of this adhesive back sandpaper that I'm going to stick to this planer sled, and that should hopefully keep the pieces from moving as they run through the planer. I also attached a couple of blocks to hold everything in place, but I discovered that I really only needed the one at the back, so I ended up removing the other one. This also did a really good job at holding the pieces on the sled and required a lot less work in the long run. Next, I started laying out my strips for my first glue up. The plan is to alternate between the maple and walnut strips. I haven't realized it yet, but I did make a bit of a mistake here by adding in one extra walnut strip for some reason. This will sort of throw off my next glue up in a bit, but don't worry, I'm not going to let that stop me. And I happen to have enough of this scrap wood to make not one, but two of these cheese slicer boards. So I'll be gifting one of them back to my mom, just as a thank you for gifting this to me in the first place. Now it's time to get all of these strips glued together. I'll be using Titebond 3 wood glue here because of its water resistancy. And I definitely wasn't shy about the amount of glue that I used. I made sure to apply a good amount and then used another little Christmas gift for my mom to spread it out. And that brings me to the sponsor of today's video. Well, I guess that'd be my mom. So thanks, Mom. Once I had these strips clamped together, I wiped away any excess glue on both sides and then left it to dry overnight. The next day, I broke out my crosscut sled to start ripping these boards down into new strips. I set my fence to cut these strips to 7/8 of an inch just like before, and I started running this board through. Side note, if you want to see how I threw together this simple crosscut sled, then make sure that you're subscribed to the channel because I'll be putting out a video next week about that. With all of my strips cut, it was time to get these glued up again. Now this is where that earlier mistake sort of came back to bite me. Because I had added that additional walnut strip, I couldn't keep these flush for the pattern to match up perfectly. So what I did was simply offset each piece and just glue it up that way. Since this was such a small board, this ended up not being that big of an issue, but for larger boards, I could see it becoming more complicated to keep that pattern together. So I'll just consider it a lesson learned for the next time. I left these boards clamped up overnight, and the next day I removed them from the clamps and worked on getting them flush on each side. Now these boards are not end grain cutting boards, so I decided to just run them through my planer a couple of times, making light passes each time. This helped get everything flush and even on the surface. Next, I had to square these boards up. I used my crosscut sled once again to get these boards square into the exact dimensions that I was after. These boards are going to need a groove for the cheese slicer wire to live. So to get that opening, I'm just going to cut a kerf on my table saw 3 inches from the edge of the board. I made sure to apply some painter's tape here to help prevent any sort of tear out. I set the depth of my blade to 3/8 of an inch and made 1 pass for each board. I needed to drill a 1/4 inch hole through the edge of the board for the hardware to slide into. Now I started this hole on my drill press to keep it as straight as possible, but I didn't have a bit long enough, so I finished off drilling the hole by hand with the longest 1/4 inch drill bit I had, which was actually a masonry bit, but hey, it still worked. Next, I rounded over every edge of this board on both sides with a 1/4 inch roundover bit. Then comes all the sanding. I started at 80 grit and worked my way through the grits until I got to 220 grit. After sanding at 220, I water popped the boards and let them fully dry. Once they were dry, I finished sanding them at 320 grit. I made sure to vacuum and remove any remaining dust with a tack cloth. And now for the most satisfying part of any cutting board build. I used Total Boat's wood honey finish here, making sure to really saturate the boards well and let it soak in. After about 15 minutes, I came back and wiped away any excess. Now it's time to attach the cheese slicer hardware. To start, I slide the top rod into the hole that I drilled until it starts to come out of the groove that I cut at the table saw. Once I can see it, I then take the looped side of the wire and hook it onto the rod. With the wire looped, I continue sliding the rod through the rest of the hole. I then screw on the little handle piece, which adds tension to the wire. I continue to screw this on until the wire is tightened and in position inside of my groove. Lastly, I wanted to add some feet to these boards, so I just attached a few to the bottoms of the boards with some screws. I'm about to step up my charcuterie game because this cheese slicer board is done. And believe it or not, it actually works pretty well too. I think it works a little quicker with smaller chunks of cheese than larger ones, but hey, I'm just happy that it not only works, but I think it looks pretty cool too. And clearly, as you can see, I'm not the only one who thinks so. I'm gonna choose to believe his enthusiasm is stemming from this awesome new kitchen tool I just crafted and not from his obsession with cheese. Who am I kidding? To be fair, I'm also a little obsessed with cheese. I hope you guys enjoyed watching me undertake my first little project of 2025. If you did, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to see everything else that I'm about to tackle this year. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next week with another video. Bye.